guess we can get started. So welcome everyone. Today's workshop is on underlying assumptions. And this is a really important workshop because I find that in a lot of instances when people do things like refutation, when people are building their arguments, they like sort of fail to consider like where their arguments are logically flowing from, like what the underlying principles are, and instead are just focusing on what is like literally said. And I think like in many instances, like you can refute arguments by just refuting the argument itself, but it's so much more powerful to consider like what the logical extension of a principle is and how you get to a particular argument. So we'll be talking a little bit about that today. So here's a basic like overview of what today's thing is going to be. First, we're going to do a quick lesson on what does it mean to recognize assumptions. Then we'll do some drills at the end, and then we'll do a quick recap and takeaways from today's seminar. So let's get started right away. All right, what is an assumption? When making a point, the premise of the argument already prescribes a certain set of beliefs, values, and underlying notions of what should be considered important, right? Those underlying notions, those underlying beliefs and values are the assumptions that that argument already makes. You have like a premise that you actually bring forward in the round in the form of an argument, but underneath that premise, you have a certain set of belief systems and value systems that are actually like, what are like holding that argument together. Right. So from those principles are what you're logically deriving your argument from. So in simple terms, like the argument is the logical extension of these beliefs and these notions, right? Your arguments have to come from somewhere. They have to come from a particular principled background. And that's what these assumptions that we're looking for are. I think that the best way to look at this is like going through examples. So let's do this, right? We're going to take 3 arguments. They're going to become relevant throughout this workshop and seminar. So like probably remember them, keep them in the back of your head. Well, let's look at some of the implications and assumptions that underlie these arguments. So starting with the first one, right? This policy would increase the number of people who have access to affordable healthcare. There's a fundamental assumption that I would make if this is an argument that I would make potentially on the government side, right? The assumption that I make here is that providing healthcare to people at a good, affordable rate is like a good thing to have, right? Provided that that is the underlying assumption, me making the argument then that more people would have access to this particular good thing, right, is a very powerful argument, right? So the underlying assumption here, right, is that this is necessarily a good thing. If this assumption is not made in this argument, then you can't really make the argument that this is inherently good by increasing the number of access to that particular thing, right? So this underlying principle here is very, very important in this context. Secondly, this policy would reduce the number of animals that have to live in the wild, right? This makes an assumption, right, that living in the wild is inherently bad, right? I think it's going to be very easy to figure out what motion this particular argument is going to come from. It's a very popular one. But anyway, this makes the fundamental assumption in this argument that for animals, living in the wild is inherently bad, right? That is why it would be a valid criticism to say that this policy would reduce the number of animals like living in the wild, right? That would be an inherently like good thing if living in the wild is inherently bad, right? So this assumption is something that exists in this context. Lastly, this policy would reduce the number of instances of voter fraud, even if voter turnout might go down. The assumption here is that less voter fraud is more important than democratic enfranchisement, right? So this is an assumption that is made about what the particular like calculus is and what should be weighed as more important from the perspective of this argument. Notably, I'm not making a claim as to whether any of these arguments are particularly good, right? Simply outlining what the underlying assumptions are. So understanding underlying assumptions is important for building good arguments yourself, but also recognizing why other arguments made by people can potentially be very weak and susceptible to criticism. So let's get into that second part a little bit. What are these motions likely to have been? The first motion was likely to be something along the lines of this House would cap the price of yearly health insurance payments, right? This would probably take place somewhere in the United States where the system is privatized and people can pay unlimited sums of money on their yearly health insurance premiums. The second motion, very likely to have been this House would ban zoos, hence a consideration of where animals have to live, right? Whether or not living in the wild is good or bad, whether or not living in captivity is good or bad. And the last one, right, very much similar to like the current United States situation going on with Republicans trying to do voter suppression. The motion would be something along the lines of like this House would place stricter laws on voter registration, right? So we can guess what these motions are likely to be. Why is understanding assumptions then important in a lot of these instances? There are 3 scenarios. The first scenario is you want to better understand what is important to the debate in order to build your own points better, right? You want a better understanding of what the principled reasons for your practical arguments are, right? That is something that might help you in constructive. I find that understanding principled assumptions, though, is even more useful in refutation in a lot of instances for two reasons. The first reason is that you want to have stronger refutation, and instead of just refuting the premise of the argument, you want to refute the whole underlying assumption, right? It's much more powerful to destroy the principle of the argument as opposed to just destroying one specific iteration of what that principle might look like, because it's a much powerful way to prevent even further arguments of them making it under the same sort of principled umbrella, right? So that's something that's really important here. But the third scenario is really important as well, right? It's where the premise is not objectively bad, but the underlying premise, the underlying principle is objectively bad, right? So it's disguised by this like surface level premise of the argument that seems good, right? But actually the underlying principle from which it comes is actually a terrible thing, and it's something we want to avoid in a particular instance, right? So these are three reasons why understanding assumptions is useful. Let's look at this then from the perspective of the motions and the arguments that we already looked at, right? So scenario one, strengthening your own argument, right? So if the motion was this house would cap the price of yearly health insurance payments, right? You're defending the underlying assumption here that healthcare and making it more accessible for people is actually a good thing, makes your case even stronger, right? You can prove an adherence to a greater principle on top of the practical benefits that you get in terms of utilitarian impacts, right? So the way you would phrase that and the way you would bring in that principled assumption that you've recognized is by saying something along the lines of like, it is not simply that this would reduce the bills of people and the fact that this is good. It is also the fact that there's a principled burden of government to intervene in order to ensure that the most amount of people have affordable healthcare, right? So it's not that you're just saying that your argument is practically good, right? But that it stems from a larger principled belief about how government should operate that is also in and of itself viewed as morally good, right? So when you can tie it to that larger principle, it makes it much more difficult to just refute your argument in a line-by-line basis on the other side, because now they're not just contending with one iteration of a particular principle, they have to contend with the principle as a whole, which makes it a much stronger case on your side. Scenarios 2 and 3, I want you to think about it like this, right? From the perspective of like a cake on a table, right? The argument itself is built on these underlying principles, premises, and assumptions, right? The argument itself is the cake, and the underlying assumption is the table. To win the debate, you simply need to destroy the cake, right? You don't necessarily need to destroy the table. Now, if you destroy the cake, right, and that's the only thing you attempt to do, you might succeed or you might not succeed. If you flip the entire table, not only will you destroy the principle, but you will by extension also destroy the argument itself. So you can, in a certain debate, not recognize assumptions and just refute arguments. But if that falls short of a particular metric, you might still leave a sufficient amount for them to rebuild based off of their principle that still stands. If you flip the entire table, the cake is destroyed, the table is turned over, there is nothing left for them to stand on, right? That is the kind of visualization I picture when I think about refuting based off of recognizing underlying assumptions in this context, right? You want to flip the whole table, destroy their principle, and by extension, destroy their argument, right? So when you think about refutation and recognizing these underlying assumptions, this is necessarily the type of visualization that I think helps a lot in considering how this works in your head. So let's go back to the motions then, right? If the motion was something along the lines of like, all right, this house would ban zoos, and you were on op, right? And you would say, oh, well, this would actually reduce the number of animals that have to live in the wild. On op, you're assuming that living in the wild is inherently bad, right? So if we wanted to refute that, we could say a few things, right? We could technically just refute the argument and say, well, if we ban zoos, then perhaps they could live in other places like research labs and whatever that are not in the wild. Therefore, this argument doesn't stand, right? But it doesn't make any sense for us to just refute the argument because the principle and the assumption underneath this argument is inherently flawed, right? I think the better response in this case is not to attack the argument directly, but to just attack this underlying assumption, right? The better response is saying living in the wild is actually better for animals, right? This is much better for their health. This is much better for their situation. This is where they're meant to be, right? So even if this argument is true, there is no indication of this argument inherently being a bad thing. And it actually works for your side of the debate because the principle that this argument assumes is inherently flawed, right? In this case, you flip the table over, right? You said, you know what, I'm not going to go after the argument because the argument in and of itself comes from a really stupid assumption. And instead, we're just going to destroy that assumption and therefore like win the refutation on that basis, right? You flip the table over and use that strategy effectively in this case by recognizing that the assumption itself is faulty. And this is where like we come to scenario 3, right? And sometimes like this is really important because in many instances, there's like a hidden like evil underlying premise, right? Like a bad underlying premise that we need to consider. if the motion is this House would place stricter laws on voter registration, if the Gov team made an argument that was like, well, this policy would reduce the number of instances of voter fraud, even if voter turnout might go down, right? Here's the thing. Objectively, less voter fraud is not a bad thing. Like voter fraud is bad, right? Like it is not a good thing to commit fraud while voting, right? But let's look at their assumption. Their assumption is less voter fraud is literally more important than democratic enfranchisement, right? Given that this is more important to them, right, to have less voter fraud than democratic enfranchisement, you have to start asking questions about why they're making this assumption, right? Who are these policies most likely to disenfranchise? Like people of color, right? Vulnerable groups in many instances that already have a terrible time of accessing things like voting opportunities in the United States, right? So in this case, yeah, the premise might seem sound that we should have less voter fraud, but if they're willing to literally trade off things like voter turnout, then their fundamental assumption is still bad, right? It's still terrible because their fundamental assumption means that less people of color, less vulnerable groups have access to democratic participation, right? It's not just that they're willing to disenfranchise people, it's that the people that are most likely to be disenfranchised are individuals that are people of color and vulnerable groups in the United States, right? So when we look at this argument, like it seems like, all right, well, this argument might be sound, but the moment we start looking at the assumption, we realize this policy is actually terrible and pretty racist, right? The premise doesn't show it, but the assumption makes it very, very clear. So in this instance, I wouldn't probably go try to engage with the argument and say, oh, well, like maybe we can prove that like less voter fraud, whatever. No, because the premise is faulty, the premise is problematic, and the premise is inherently discriminatory, right? So in this case, recognizing this assumption is the key to taking down this argument, right? It's figuring out why are they making these assumptions? Why are they making these underlying trade-offs? And why are their underlying beliefs and value systems in accordance to these particular metrics, right? This asking questions about this assumption, right, actually gets us a lot further in destroying this argument than simply considering the argument itself, right? So very important for us to consider these implications.